Hello, everyone. This presentation is about reviewing the literature and writing the literature review for your dissertation. Um, I'll mainly be talking about how to go about writing your literature review, but I'll also talk at the beginning a little bit about why we do the literature review. So, all research and particularly all dissertations contain a review of the literature, usually as a discrete chapter near the beginning of the dissertation. Um, Not all research or not all dissertations have that chapter. Some, for instance, um, particularly dissertations which draw more on the traditions of the humanities, for example, might be more like an extended essay and so have the literature woven all the way through. And there's also a distinct research methodology called a systematic literature review. And in that methodology, the whole project and therefore the whole dissertation is a review of the literature. But those are quite sort of distinct forms of literature reviews, and I'm not going to deal with those two here. There's nothing to stop you doing those kinds of research, but they're not what I'm going to talk about here. What I am going to talk about is why and how most dissertations have a literature review chapter and how to write that chapter. The main thing, right, the most important point I think to take away from this presentation is to think about reviewing the literature as a two-step process, right? A two-phase process. So there's the early phase of the task of reviewing the literature. That's step one, conducting your review of the literature. And then the second phase, which I think it's important to keep separate, is writing the literature review chapter, right? So there's the actual reviewing stage and there's the second writing stage, and I think it's helpful to think about it in those two steps. Okay, so that's the beginning, and we'll move on now to think about why you review the literature. So I've said that all research contains some form of literature review, and you might wonder why bother, right? Why bother reviewing the literature? Um, well, there are a number of very good reasons for reviewing the literature. The main thing is that really it's helpful for you. So the process should support the rest of your endeavour, the rest of your research project. Now, it's admittedly partly convention or tradition that all research begins or contains a literature review. But there's a very good reason, or rather a set of very good reasons for that convention. Firstly, it's to acknowledge that the work that you're doing exists in relation to an existing body of work, right? So you're studying for a master's. You need to show that you have mastered a range of literature relevant to your research study. So you need to be able to locate your study within an existing body of work, and through that show that you are familiar with key works, key writers, key ideas, key concepts, key theories that are relevant to your study, and begin to show how you will use them in your study. Now, the process of doing a literature review should help you think through and develop your ideas around and your design for the rest of your research project. So, in your research, in your review of the literature, you should be really thinking about introducing not only the topic, but the key ideas, the key concepts, the key theories, which you will later be drawing on in your analysis of your data. So it's not just a case of talking about what literature or what studies have gone on before, but introducing the tools that you'll use in the rest of your investigation. So this is in the stage of reviewing the literature as opposed to writing the literature review. Your reviewing of the literature should be helping you to, as it says here, conceptualize your study, define your research questions, help you focus down on a specific topic, and show how you can synthesize ideas and concepts to begin to arrive at an informed position on your topic and how you will investigate it. So, this process of reviewing the literature can help you in a number of ways. So, firstly, it's an opportunity to develop your own research skills, those skills of searching, sorting, sifting through a body of work in order to find what is most relevant to you and then constructing an argument, a review around that body of literature. Now, this might be seem a bit daunting at first, but you're not necessarily alone in this. So the companion reading for this, Zena O'Leary's chapter, gives you some strategies and approaches that you can use in order to conduct a search for literature. But our librarians are also extremely helpful. So a really good first move is to go and have a one-to-one with one of our librarians, and they will help you formulate your literature search and develop those research skills. The other, or a second helpful aspect of reviewing the literature is that it can help you move from a position of uncertainty or vagueness about what you're going to do to a position of clarity and more certainty. So a lot of students find it difficult to move from, and a lot of researchers in fact find it difficult to move from a kind of overall topic area or a general idea of what they want to research to a much more clearly defined, tightly focused study. And the literature review can help you with exactly that. It can help you to clarify exactly what questions you're asking, what hypothesis or theory you're going to test or use. Think specifically about what issues you want to explore in relation to your topic, or perhaps exactly what problems you are trying to solve. And through that process of thinking through, conceptualizing, and focusing in, the literature review can ultimately provide both you and us as your supervisors with a very clear picture of what you are studying and how you are approaching your study. So, although the literature review is usually a chapter that comes at the beginning or towards the beginning of your dissertation, it is actually an ongoing process, reviewing the literature, that doesn't really stop until you hand the work in or about to submit the work. So, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that a good literature review does is introduce the key theories and concepts that will later come into play in the analysis phase and the analysis chapter of your work. So, reviewing the literature and refining and adjusting and rewriting your literature review is an ongoing part of doing your research project. So, yes, in the early stages, it will help you to firstly identify a broad research area and then narrow that down to a specific topic through paying attention to the ways in which research about your topic is often done. The literature review can help you then decide on your approach to investigating your topic. It can help you develop your project plan and then think about what kinds of data you're going to collect, how you're going to collect and analyze it, and then present your findings. So when it comes later on to writing your analysis chapter, you should be referring back to things that you first introduced in your literature review. In this way, your dissertation will form a coherent whole, rather than what might appear to be just a sequence of chapters that have kind of been slammed together. So to get that coherent whole, you need to keep working on your literature review throughout the lifetime of your project. But doing so is helpful, right? So that's why it's good to do it. So on this slide, we have a visual representation of those two stages of the literature review that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. So on the one hand, on the left-hand side of your screen here, there are a set of reasons for reviewing the literature, so that's the early reviewing phase. And then on the right hand side, you've got the purposes of the literature review chapter in your work. And this is again taken from Zena O'Leary's companion reading. So you've got reasons for reviewing the literature. Firstly, to inform yourself of what is happening in your field, right? You need to know that, or you need to look like you know what you're on about, right? If you're going to be a master of something, so you need to be informed about what is going on in the field. You need to gain a level of topical, so current knowledge on your topic, and methodological knowledge and expertise. In other words, how research tends to be done on the topic that you are interested in. Surveying the literature can help you find what is often called a gap in the literature. So a gap in the literature that may help you justify your own study and formulate research questions. Through paying attention to methodology and methods, you can critically evaluate how research tends to be done or not done in your area. And that in turn can help you think through the next step of your project, and that's thinking about your methodological approach, right? So those are the reasons for reviewing the literature. And you can see that those are a slightly different set of reasons than those for the purposes of the literature review chapter. So let's take a look at those. Right, so those are informing your audience of what is happening in your field. Now, for you, your audience is largely your supervisor, right? So your supervisor needs convincing that you know what you're on about, right? That you know what is happening in your field, right? So your literature review chapter can help with that. That in turn helps you establish with your supervisor and whoever else might be looking at your work, an external examiner, for instance, that you are a knowledgeable researcher, right? That you have mastered a body of literature. When you've done that, you are in then a good position to demonstrate the relevance and significance of your research question. And as we move towards the end of your literature review, and you begin to think about the next chapter, the methodology and methods chapter, you can begin to start justifying your methodological approach. So it helps you to link forward into and justify what you're going to do in the rest of your study. Now we're going to think about the phase where you actually sit down and begin to write your literature review, having conducted your search and review of a body of work. So this set of questions might help you to work out what you should write about. So what research has been carried out that is relevant to your study? What are the main considerations to be drawn from this body of work? So what is most relevant in what you found to the study that you're going to do? Now, we often talk about being critical of research that you are evaluating or reviewing. Now, that doesn't mean just criticising in the sense of, talking about what's bad or missing, but it means making some judgments about the work. So one way to do that are through the final three set of questions on this slide here. So think about and talk about, write about ways in which previous studies are similar to each other. So have different studies, for instance, reached similar conclusions or drawn on similar methods. Then how are they different? So where are their variations in what people have found or how they've studied a particular phenomenon? And where are there gaps in knowledge? So what seems to be missing? What hasn't been done? And that might be something at a very local level, right? So it might be that you are, for instance, writing about a particular trend in, say, teaching and learning and pedagogy that seems to be taking hold at an international or a national level, but no one's really studied it, at your level, in your school or in your area or in your region. So it might be that the gap is there, right? So Um, that's the kind of thing that we're often talking about when we are mention a gap in knowledge. It's not that we're expecting some great leap forward or theoretical insight. It's about finding a niche for your study. Now, another way to think about your literature review is that it contextualizes and helps you to justify your study. Right? Why is your research worth doing? Which is a question all researchers really have to answer. So we can talk about this in terms of the significance of your study. Now, again, significance doesn't have to mean a great leap forward, right? It means just showing some awareness of the contribution that you can make to the existing body of work through your own research. So the significance of your study, as it says here, can take a variety of forms. Now, you probably won't want to emphasize all of these because it's quite a long list, but some of them, perhaps two or three of them, are likely to be relevant to your research. So if we just work through them, you might make a contribution to long-running academic or theoretical discussions. You might help to explain or illuminate contemporary social or educational phenomena. You might bring attention to social or educational issues likely to be of increasing importance. You might make an original contribution to an existing body of knowledge or theory. You might provide local perspective on a broader issue. Or you might bring together or fuse knowledge from a number of related fields in order to advance existing knowledge in an innovative fashion. In other words, in a way that hasn't been done before. So you are, in essence, providing a context for your proposed study and demonstrating why it's important and timely. And this helps you to establish the significance or the importance of your work. So if I just give an example, something that I've done research on recently and published research on recently is on the use of mobile phones in education, in higher education particularly, and how that relates to students' literacy practices. And that really ticks a number of these boxes here, right? So there's a contribution to a long-running or academic theoretical discussion around the nature of literacy and how that's related to learning, linked to a contemporary social and educational phenomena, right? The use of mobile phones inside and out of classrooms. And through focusing on a case study at this university, I was providing a local perspective on a broader issue. So I could argue that in that bit of research, right, how students use mobile phones in higher education at Hope University, I've got three areas of significance, right? So you might want to think about what the areas of significance are for your research project, and then write those in to your literature review. And now we begin to think about what your literature review should look like. What you really, really want to avoid is a kind of source by source or what's sometimes called a laundry list type literature review, right? So this is the kind of literature review that says Smith and Jones in 2014 found this, and then Green and Brown in 2016 found that, and then somebody else in another year found the other. And it just reads like a big long list of research that you happen to have read. Now, there's problems with that approach. Firstly, it tends to be, it is by definition very linear, and that makes it very wordy. So it's not a very economical way to present what you want to talk about, and it also makes it, frankly, quite boring, right? So the reader is just left with a big long list of studies that you happen to have read and are probably not engaged with terribly critically. A much better approach, and the approach that we would advocate, is for you to organise your literature by themes. So this means thinking about what are the big ideas, right? The recurring ideas that seem to come through in the body of literature that you've reviewed, and then organizing your literature review into subsections based on those themes. So rather than going source by source, and perhaps in a fairly chronological way, right, year by year, if you like, or decade by decade through the research, you organize it into subsections based on your themes, and then that helps you to structure your literature review in the form of developing an argument based on the key concepts, the recurring ideas um, that are present in the review, in the literature you reviewed, rather than simply describing a long list of other studies. So one way to do this, for instance, is to think about how you actually organise the literature that you've got. So in the good old days of paper, I, for instance, would I'd have printouts of all the research that I'd reviewed, and I would literally lay it in piles on the floor according to what theme I thought it belonged in, and then within each text, I would sort of colour code the highlighting so that I knew that although a bit of research might essentially or on balance belong in one theme, it might link to some studies in another theme, and the colour coding would help me to remember and then write about those links. These days, of course, like most people, I don't work in paper anymore, but you get the idea, right? You can organise your own literature in the same sorts of way through folders and colour coding in order to help you establish the themes. Another way to help you think about research thematically and then to plan a thematic literature review is to do some sort of diagrammatic representation of the literature. So, for instance, a mind map or a concept map of your key themes and which studies you'll write about in relation to those themes. So a mind map as a planning step might help. Or alternatively, and this is again in the companion reading, Zena O'Leary, alternatively, you might do like a Venn diagram, right, to show your key concepts and how they overlap, and again, which are the studies that you'll talk about within each aspect, within each theme. Right, so before you begin to write the literature review, get it organised and have a plan for writing your literature review, and then write to your plan. And in terms of the overall structure, people often talk about a kind of funnel or maybe a T-shape or this kind of inverted pyramid or inverted triangle. And this represents moving from more general overview type sources at the beginning of your literature review or the introductory section, and gradually focusing down and down and down and down and down into a particular focus on your topic, on your study. So you work through your subtopics, you work through your concepts, moving from the more general to the much more specific. So, for instance, in that work on mobile phones and literacy I was talking about earlier, the opening part of my literature review talked initially about trends in mobile phone ownership and use globally. And then it talked about changes in conceptualizations of literacy practices over the last sort of 5 or 10 years, well, 10 years. Then it began to talk about mobile phone use in higher education, and then it began to talk about students' perspectives on literacy and mobile phone use. So that is the kind of move from the broad to the very focused and the very narrow. And then you want to conclude your literature review with some sort of summary that tells the reader very clearly and ambiguously, now you've reviewed the literature, what are the main considerations for researchers to emerge from that review? What then are the implications or the justifications that arise from that review for your own approach, your own questions? And then how will you challenge, confirm, or build on aspects of that existing body of work? Now, this notion of synthesis, right, of bringing together, knitting together, combining in new ways, is crucial, right, in doing a good literature review or writing a good literature review chapter. So don't just summarize step by step or study by study what you've read. Right? Critically engage with the material. So talk about what it does well, what's missing, what its strengths are, what its limitations are, and so on. So synthesizing is crucial in demonstrating your knowledge and your critical engagement with the topic. So you want to recombine the evidence that you found into something new in order to demonstrate that you're producing a critical interpretation of the literature and not just kind of parroting it back, not just reporting it back. Um, and as we've already seen, that has a major advantage in helping you avoid being too linear and therefore boring, but also helps you to develop an argument for your own approach based on that substantial body of evidence that you've been looking at. So, a good way to develop a synthesis is to look for patterns in the literature. Um, so, there's an example on the slide here. So, for example, Davis in 1992 said this, but then Bolt went further and argued that. But more recently, Smith and Jones suggested the other. So, you're looking for a pattern there, the development of an argument around the body of literature, not just reporting on what different studies have said. Now, there's a list here of different kinds of sources that you might want to draw on. Some of these you'll know, and some are perhaps less known to you, right? Books, journal articles, conference papers, policy documents, legislation, newspapers, blogs, existing theses and dissertations. So there's a bunch of those in the library, and you can also get them online. Reviews and reports, so these might be from governments or charities or regulatory bodies or whatever, as well as published statistics. So your literature review probably wants a blend of these different kinds of sources, and you probably don't need all 10, right? But you probably want a blend of at least some of these. But again, to engage with them critically. So you don't want, obviously, a literature review at master's level, which is largely based on newspaper stories, right? The bulk of what you write about has got to be scholarly, peer-reviewed research. But newspaper articles might be helpful, not only for helping you to get a sense of trends in what you're interested in, um, um, but also perhaps for you to engage with critically about reporting on a particular topic, for instance. And the same with other sorts of grey sources of literature like blogs, right? You probably don't want to be referring to a whole list of blogs, but they might be useful in giving examples of something that you're studying about. So think about combining different kinds of sources, and again, the librarians can help you to locate these. Think about combining different kinds of sources, but think critically about the nature of each source. And that's what we'll look at next. So this slide gives you some ideas for how you should judge a piece of academic writing, and it draws on the work of Jerry Wellington, who's a very well-known writer on research methodology and methods. So questions you can ask in order to be critical about the literature that you are reviewing. Number one, does the literature review in that bit of research, right, the literature review in what you're looking at, give a useful overview of a range of relevant literature? Is it creative? Does it suggest alternative areas of literature that could be applied? Two, is there a clear theoretical framework that helps you understand the writing? Does it shed any new light on existing theories or models? Three, are the aims and purpose of the research clear? Four, do the methods appear to match the aims? So is there a good fit, in other words? Five, is it a reflective account, i.e. is there some sort of self-evaluation of strengths and limitations? Six, are the conclusions reasonable and linked back to the literature review? So remember I told you that that's what you need to do. So are these writers doing it? And then seven, is the work clearly written and structured? Is it verbose? Is it turgid? Is it grandiose? So all of these things can help you make decisions about the literature that you're reviewing, but you can also, of course, use them to self-assess your own work, right? Your own review of the literature when you get to that stage. So I finished with just giving you the references for Zena O'Leary's book and Jerry Wellington's book, which I've drawn on for this presentation. Do please read the companion piece, that is Zena O'Leary's chapter in the third edition of her book now, and then complete the tasks. Thank you.